Hello and welcome again to Backpage. I'm Jody C. and today we're visiting with Amanda Powell, who's a poet and a translator and a teacher at the University of Oregon. And we're going to talk a lot about poetry and especially her book called Prowler. So welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Tell me about your work. Let me back up. We've had a lot of poets on the show, and primarily because I don't really understand poetry like I feel like I should. But we've had some really good ones. You know, Kate Gray's been on, Paul Peterson, and a jillion of them. But so talk to me about your work. Why poetry for you?
I think poetry required that I pay attention to it and write it. I think it found me.
Okay.
And I think that we live. I think we wake up in language, and our minds are apparently, literally wired. If we believe Noam Chomsky and the structuralist linguists, that our minds are created to create with language, and apparently every human culture uses words to extend beyond itself and get to know itself, to reach, the powers that be, in chants and language. People start making patterns with language. Patterns are satisfying to us. So we measure lengths of words, or we make the beginning sounds alike, or we make the end sounds alike. We just start crafting things with words. And I remember when I was 13, I had a little crisis, and my best friend played the flute, and she was really good. It was clearly already too late for me to do something like that because I hadn't started yet.
Right.
I thought that everyone has words, and maybe writing was something I could do. But I was already writing poetry by that time, so that was when I started, thinking of myself more seriously in that direction.
Do you teach poetry?
I do. I teach Spanish literature at the University of Oregon, and I focus especially on poetry.
So when you talk about poetry, or do you get your students to write poetry, to start writing their own?
I do. I get them to write, and I'm very happy when they write poems. And I teach especially medieval and early modern literature. Although not only, I also teach modern stuff, and so it depends on the class. But especially the earlier stuff. And so that poetry is really structured. And I have the students start playing with that and start, trying, seeing what they can do. Sometimes with extraordinary results, occasionally really extraordinary. And always they end up with more respect for what the poets are doing.
Well, the thing that I noticed about your poetry, and I never know why this is when I see it in poetry. There'll be all of the words configured over here, and then there's maybe a big space, and then maybe one word. And I don't think I'm an especially stupid person, but sometimes I go, why did they do it that way? Like, what is that? What makes you write it like that? Talk to me, I'm trying to understand.
It's as if it were musical notation for me. And I hear the words with a shape. And occasionally I work with formal structures. I do sometimes something starts coming to me and it rhymes, and then I work to follow that through and be consistent. But not often. That's not the school of poetry that I read lots of poetry and formal structures, but the time of poetry that that I grew up in was working with concepts like organic verse, Denise Levertov's concept of organic verse, where the shape of the words follows the breath and follows some sense of an internal pulse in the poem as it's taking shape. And so I want the shape of the poem on the page to suggest the breath, the pause. Something I see it as a kind of a sculpture made of words, something three-dimensional, maybe four-dimensional,
See, that makes sense to me. I mean, but nobody's ever explained it like this.
That's how I work with it.
Yeah. So, you're also a translator, and you translate from what to what?
I translate from Spanish to English.
Okay. And how do you do that?
I read the poem, if I'm translating a poem, which I particularly like doing and wrestle with. And I read the poem in that sense as a sculpture that I'm climbing into, or even more than a sculpture, maybe a mobile. And I pay the most attention to what effects a particular poem seems to me, as best I can read it, to be creating in Spanish. And then I start thinking how, could we do that in English? Could I do that in English? Could I create those effects in English? And that's what I try to do.
So clearly you're fluent in Spanish.
I'm pretty good.
Yeah.
I'm teaching it at the university.
Yeah. So you teach Spanish also?
I do.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, I'm teaching this literature, I'm teaching Spanish literature in Spanish.
Okay. Really?
Yes.
Wow. I'm trying to wrap my brain around that,
Yeah, well, that's what we do. We teach
So-
French literature in French and Italian.
So talk to me about this book, The Answer, La Respuesta.
The Answer, La Respuesta, is by a 17th century Mexican poet and intellectual and feminist who was a nun. Her name is Sor, which means sister, Juana Inés de la Cruz.
Wow.
And she lived in Mexico City. She was born south of there on an hacienda that was run by her mother, moved to Mexico City, which was the capital of the viceroyalty in that period, was taken into the viceregal court as a very young woman, wowed them all with her learning, real erudition. She was extraordinary in Latin and in Spanish. And then entered the convent and lived in the convent for the rest of her life and wrote all kinds of poetry, love poetry, secular love poetry, some devotional poetry, poems that were commissioned by cathedrals to be sung as part of the Mass during big celebrations for saints' days. And
Did she have to sneak that stuff out of there? I mean, were
She
they okay
didn't.
with it?
They were and they weren't. It depends, as in any complex institution with regards to the church, some of them were great with it and some of them were not. And for a couple of decades, she had a really good run. She had the support of the court, very powerful political figures, and support of some particular figures within the church. Near the end of her life, something different seems to have happened. But for, especially the decade of the 1680s, and sometime on either side of that,
That was
she
a
had
rockin' time.
That was her, she was in the zone and became world famous because she was published during her lifetime in Spain with books that were then immediately sold in Spain and exported to the Spanish colonies, which composed the Spanish Empire, which was the ruling empire in that period. So from the Philippines to Europe to North Africa to the so-called New World, the Americas, her work was distributed and being read. So she was she was a blockbuster bestseller during
Wow.
that period. Yeah.
How'd you find all this stuff out?
I had a wonderful professor when I was an undergraduate who said, you're interested in the Baroque and you're always looking for women writers, and there's this woman in Mexico. And she said to me back then, there hasn't been that much work done on her, which was back then. And in Mexico and in the field of Hispanism, as we call it, in Spanish letters, now there's been a lot of work on her, and yet she still isn't very well known outside of my field and, a few curious, readers who pursue things.
Did you do your thesis on her?
I've worked on her consistently, yes, starting actually with an enormous undergraduate thesis that was focused on her. and moving on from there. I then went and looked for her context. I thought, well, you've got St. Teresa of Avila, people have heard of her in the 16th century, and then you've got this amazing woman in Mexico in the 17th century. They were both nuns. You know, there will have been others, I thought to myself, and I got a little bit of money and went to Spain to look for them, and I thought it would be hard, and it wasn't hard at all. There were more than dozens. There were hundreds.
Really?
Of women writing really interesting things, especially in convents. Also, some aristocratic women, and a few really intellectual and learned, you know, bourgeois women as well. And so then I spent a couple of decades really working a lot on them, but also always continuing to work on Sor Juana, and so it's been very exciting because it's filled in a whole picture. I mean, I was part of helping to rediscover these writers and help make them known.
Well, hey, if you're just tuning in, I'm Jody C. This program is Backpage, and we're visiting with Amanda Powell about her poetry and other people's poetry as well. This book is called Prowler. This is your latest, hot off the press.
Yes.
And I noticed on the back here you had an endorsement from Anita Sullivan. We had Anita on the show.
Yes.
Anita Sullivan and Carter McKenzie were here one time. And so talk to me about this book. Is there a theme for you that made you want to put all of these particular poems together in a book, or? And do you say poem or poem?
I say, I say poem, somewhere in between.
Okay.
But yeah.
Because I have a friend in San Francisco who calls it poems.
Poems.
And apparently that's the latest Rudy Toot way to say it. And
Okay.
doesn't sound right to me, but you know, it's like P-O-E-M-S.
I know people who say poem. I don't know. I try to fall in the middle, I guess.
Anyway, so there were some things about your childhood in here, but do you have a favorite one?
Would you like me to read one?
Yeah, I would, if you have a
It's
favorite.
easier to do the poems than talk about them. And I can start with the title Poem, which in the book comes at the end. I think, so I want the poems to point towards it. And I'll pick it out first because it is the title poem and because it gives the focus to the concept of the prowler,
Okay.
which I mean to be a complex image of disturbance, but also inquiry, and also, I guess there's a Pandora's box concept for me in the book, that if we don't open the door, if Pandora had clapped the box shut and not opened it at the end, that other little tiny voice calling out from inside the box when all the chaos and pandemonium had been released, couldn't also have been released into the world. That's what this poem is about.
Okay.
Prowler, August, 3 a.m. By mistake, we left the summer door open, and the dark walked in, with its crickets of loss, 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 and its chipped velvet appurtenances. The dipper wheels above the apple tree, though we picked almost the last, the littlest. Though parents age and fall, friends, though blight cankers the young. When I would nod on my pillow, a wild spangle won't stop between pines, its old alert to complicated comfort, alive in this world now.
So as a poet, how do you know when you're done?
Well, I get a feeling in my body.
Good. I do too. I mean, I don't write poetry, but when I write a story, there's a feeling that shows up in your body. And when it's not done, there's also a feeling, but it's a different one. You know, like,
Oh, damn.
yeah, like when you're
hoped I
trying
was
to
done.
remember if you left the iron on or something, you know? Anyway, yeah, so that's good. That's good. So read another one.
I'll
to
read
us.
another one, and this one was published by OSU Press in,
Which is a very good organization.
yeah, it's a wonderful organization.
They do good work.
And it was an anthology of Oregon poetry that this appears in. And I'm picking it out because it's got the concept of night, which is a concept that runs through the book, and because we're in square dance, because we're always in square dance season, but because we're in county fair, season. Square dance at the fairgrounds. Night everywhere. Night in our cherry red lipstick, we 4 women grinning without thought of tickets or payment, past the ticket taker and his 2 grinning, elbowing friends, and in under the clique lights of the sheep sheds. Night, black under the prize sheep's blue felt hooded jackets that guard against soils working into the fleece by night. Night, spilled in the oxen's stiff-sweated, pitched agitation when the whip cracks, the beefy driver shrills, the massy granite blocks just budged. And those packed inches the stone lurches down the fairgrounds, too, are night. And night is the otter gleam of the women's softball team champion in her swimsuit, shouldering out of the dunking tub to dangle her legs again from the hinged, puddled platform. Each water drop beams a circling midway, neon orbits tangible as the glass buttons and plastic pearls that stud the men's western shirts nipped into belted jeans, the smocked, tucked promises edging the women's designer jeans or ruffled dirndls. All local people ably partnered and handing themselves or the others around each figure of the square, certain, accordingly as they are woman or man, of each neat step in turn, while our galaxy, at some 1.3 million miles per hour, flows down the lavish night. We came to dance. We're city people. Artists, I imagine the real dancers, to confirm with neutral tone and nod, like forefinger tap to forehead, explaining it all. How we can't square our set or recall who's partnered with whom, let alone which of the women are men, and, as our friends join in, which one of the men is being a man and should go first, do-si-do your partner, your corner, and allemande left. Night narrowing between the nearing hands, and then, as they meet, night clasped there. The farm and small townspeople, kindly forbearing, discern our need for remedial instruction and the slower tunes, while night circles in the caller's recitative, and I'm whirled by a tender, querulous Marxist who, when the band takes a break, shares his analyses of square dancing, historical, social, material, from 18th to 20th centuries, with and by whom to be swung, now swing that lady, is to fly, pure and simple, in a body, a long pink skirt someone gave me, and wide red belt, in the night, at the fair, among stars that, as they whirl from our lives, are asking, what is night? What is class? Species? Gender? Sheep fleece, ox sweat, sawdust, hills, hayfields, hands, come now to the grand right and left with your answers.
When you were a little girl and people asked you what you wanted to be, did you say, I want to be a poet or a teacher or a translator?
The very first thing, I had a little figure, I had a little figure on my bedside, and the very first thing I thought was, what's the most beautiful thing you can be? That's a girly thought.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, a ballerina. And I was not cut out for it.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I thought, well, what's the most important thing or something? And I loved school, and I thought, teacher.
Teacher, yeah.
But then I thought, what's the best thing in life? And that was books. So then I thought writer.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know when I started saying it to people, but I started thinking when I was a little girl I wanted to be a writer.
Where'd you grow up? Here?
In Massachusetts.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
You're a long way from the house. You
Yeah.
made a wrong turn on Interstate 80, and here you are.
Here I am.
How'd that all work out?
That worked out through love and a job. Yeah.
I had a client who was from Alaska, and she said you'd be astonished in Alaska the number of stories that start with, well, I met this guy.
But I met this woman.
Yeah, well, there you go. So.
And we got hired as a couple at the University of Oregon.
Really?
Yes, in 1990. So.
What does your partner teach?
My partner is professor of English.
Wow. So has she written anything?
She has.
Well.
She has, and you will enjoy talking with her.
I bet
And
I
she's
will.
a singer as well. Yes.
Really?
She's a professor of English and folklore, and she's a folk singer.
Well, we've had
Scholar.
actually singers on this show too, people who write musicals and songs and all sorts of stuff. So talk to me about what you're working on now. What is the what's the big push?
I'm always writing poems, and I am working on reconfiguring a book-length manuscript, and I will be working on sending that out. And I'm always working on several things.
Have you ever written anything other than poetry?
Oh yeah,
Okay.
I've written some essays. I've only published one or two. I mean, creative nonfiction, personal essays.
Yeah.
I write scholarly, academic stuff all the time. So I'm working on a conference paper, and I've just finished an article, and those are on Baroque poetry and relate to Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz and some other poets of the period. And I'm also translating a novel, a contemporary novel from Costa Rica by an author named Uriel Quesada. And I just got really exciting news a couple of months ago that I got a grant from the NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts, of Translation Fellowship. So that will help a lot with that project.
Good, congratulations.
Thank you. I'm really excited about that.
They're not all that easy to get, I wouldn't think.
They're not, and I have applied and applied for support for this project, and I love this project. It's a very funny book of just tumbling language. It does a kind of pastiche of different literary styles. It's a gay novel. It tells a story of a man who was ejected from the family home for being gay when he was young, and makes his way back when his father is ailing, and deals very humorously and insightfully with the family drama in a way that is really piercing and very funny. I think it's a real plus. I think it's a book that really deserves to be out there, so I'm very excited about doing it.
How did you get that project?
I often have taught a workshop in literary translation between Spanish and English with people who are first language speakers of Spanish, first language speakers of English, and completely bilingual, a mix of grown-ups who love literature and love thinking about translation in Mexico. And Uriel Quesada, the author, came along to that workshop, and I met him because he was a participant in my workshop in Mexico. He was interested in translation himself, and his work was being translated, and he wanted to know how to talk to translators about it. And so we met and had a chance to look at his work. He gave me copies of his books. I just fell in love with this novel. And I also got to see that it was true. Some translations of some of his short stories were being done that weren't that great, so or that maybe had some problems. So I asked him if I could do his novel, and we've been working on it together.
Wow.
Very slowly. I'll be able to give more time to it now with the grant.
So when you translate, I mean, things get lost in translation. That's what, the meaning or something is slight and that changes the whole meaning of everything. And so how do you, when you're translating something from, say, Spanish to English, how do you know that you've gotten that exactly right, exactly what the author meant?
It goes back to that sense of the mobile that I climb into. A mobile because it's three-dimensional, and it's mobile. It moves, and if I jostle something too much in one way, or take a whole part off, the balance will be completely gone. And I want to respect every part of it. Robert Frost said that poetry is that which gets lost in translation. There's a wonderful translator of poetry and poet, Elliot Weinberger, who amended that to say poetry is that which is worth translating. Yes, something is always lost. And then one looks for what can be recompensated in some other way. And what are the effects of the poem in the original? What can I do in English to create that impact for the reader? If it's inherently in the sounds of the words, then I better get busy finding word sounds in English. They won't be the same. They won't be the same words. So then, if it's creating a web in Spanish, how can I create a web in English? If thought predominates, if image predominates, how can I represent that? Still attending to emphases, sounds, and so forth.
Well, see, when I was reading your bio information, and I thought, translator, whoa, it's so much bigger than just what we, well, she said this, and this is what she meant, we think. It's
Yes,
way bigger than that.
With poetry in particular, it's more than gist. Would you like me to read a translation?
Actually, we're running short on time, but I wanted to know if you could tell us very quickly, if people are interested in your work and they want to buy this, what do they do?
That would be great. They can get online, and they can look me up through Amazon or directly through the press, which is Finishing Line Press.
Okay, good. So we're going to have to wrap it up, but thank you so much for joining us. I'm Jody C. This program is Back Page. Be sure to join us again next time as we take another peek at the back page, and remember, we're all in this together. More the same than different. Do your best. Thank you.